All right. Hi, my name's Taylor Vanderhelm. I'm a product designer with the editor extensions team. So a little bit of a different sort of user focus than a lot of the other GitLab designers who are working in the web IDE. So I'll just give a quick background of a little bit of the users that we're going over. And what I'm focusing on is our IDE first dual chat initiative. So just so everyone's on the same page, Duo Chat is accessible in the right-hand panel. It was initially launched as well, it is still a shared UI component. And so it's used here, but we also use it in our IDEs. So it'll appear when you install it, say VS Code, it's in your tab on the left-hand side and will be um, accessible that way as well. So we had an initiative, or sorry, David mentioned that we want to make it a goal to really provide excellent product experiences that um, are going beyond just meeting the immediate needs. And we found on the editor extensions team, we've been under a lot of pressure to ship features because the market's moving very fast, especially in the AI space. And I wanted to present a solution that was a little bit more longer focused in the way that we could really lean into providing an excellent solution that's not just sort of repurposing or trying to be a little bit too generic and missing some of the strengths that the IDE has. So started with this just labeled as a design exploration, and it's really focusing on code authors. So in the IDs, this is a big, the main job performer usually, and they're developing app improvements for their application would be sort of the main job there. For this particular task, really focusing on when you're generating a lot of code with AI or working with AI, there's always that risk of introducing um, bugs or mistakes. So really trying to present something that minimizes that those the likelihood that that happens. And this has caused, so this was actually a learning for me was I had started calling it IDE native, which ended up becoming confusing specifically for engineers who thought that meant we had to build with IDE native components. So I switched it to calling it IDE first. It's basically just trying to provide a Duo experience that's like purpose built for developer workflows inside the IDE. So instead of trying to have a perfect shared experience when we've got different job performers across different environments, that gets really tricky. So I'll jump into my Figma file. Okay, so in Figma now, um, basically the approach that I took was since this was a little bit different in that it was very open-ended and trying to move beyond just requirements for this particular um, short-term issue. This was much more generic and much more trying to present an opinion from a design perspective. So how I started with was treating it more like an exercise. So how can we make the chat experience feel world class versus a repurposed web view? So this was something that um, was more of a aspirational goal, and then I was trying to work backwards. So how might I do this? So I was familiar with the product. I broke it into steps. Like first, there's the appearance. It's got to feel like it blends in with the ID rather than just being like very awkwardly shoehorned in. Um, the next step would be interactions. So the ID uses a lot of unique patterns. For example, it's a tool that developers are using daily. So keyboard hotkeys are a big one. They often can learn very complex workflows, and it becomes an important part of their day-to-day work and really speeds up their productivity. And then there's also um, just customization of there's a lot of personalization or sorry, customization that goes on because each user has their own unique setup. Some might be using multiple monitors, some might be using laptops, some prefer to set specific custom hotkeys for different flows. Others prefer to keep it aligned with what the IDE provides. So there's a lot of need for flexibility there. The next one would be the quality of the responses, is how can we improve the way that Duo uses prompts and that users can, like the prompt is a big part of how it is, but then there's also what we do behind the scenes. And the next one would be just trying to think ahead of what are some new patterns and workflows that we can do at GitLab that our competitors can't do. We have a awesome product that you can integrate so many different, you can do so many different steps of the software development lifecycle in one place, and that's a really cool strength. So trying to think of ways that we could think about that in the future and really make Duo again world class. So I started again with an exercise. This is what I often do. Just what would chat look like if I used like the terminal as my inspiration? So rather than before by competitors who had desktop apps, who had web first apps, and keeping in mind that a lot of this was driven from that and we're figuring it out as we go. And so with this approach is more, what if I work the other way? I'm focusing just on the IDE. I'm not thinking about all the other trade-offs. I'm just trying to design for the developer in the IDE and what's more familiar to the developer and more minimal but information dense than terminal interaction. So there seemed to be a lot of crossover there. So I tried to start designing. I won't go into this too much because I could spend probably like 2 hours doing this. But essentially, I went through, broke it up into the different stages of going through. So you'd have your empty state, you'd enter a prompt, you'd wait for response loading, you'd get a response, etc. And I went through and designed different variations of them. So you can see here variation one, variation two, working on things like what if we had tabs? So in the terminal, you often have tabs between chats. Maybe that could work here. Another thing you often see is the empty states helping users learn the hotkeys. Because once they learn those hotkeys and adopt it, it speeds up their workflow, but it's also a nice way to do onboarding without being annoying. And it still keeps it very minimal rather than using a graphic. So I think we no longer, I think we might have removed our graphic recently, but we used to use a large icon that was very web-based. And I might have an example here. Yeah, so you can see here, we would have a large um, image, large text, large buttons. It just felt like a web experience put into the IDE, and it often required resizing. These are all things we've been working to improve, but that's where I was coming from, is how to make it. The IDE is an extremely noisy environment, and so wanting to make it uh, as it's information dense. We want to communicate as much as we can, give as much flexibility, but it can quickly become overwhelming. And so anytime that even a small sort of reducing noise, it really pays off. So yeah, essentially I went through each step and how someone might use Duo in their workflow. So adding context, for example, all the different ways we might do that. In terminals, we often use some terminal tools will use spell out rather than using icons. So again, it seems minor, but when like latency in the IDE is extremely important. So fractions of a second when you're doing it over and over and over again can start to feel annoying. So anything to do to reduce latency, make it feel a little bit faster. So again, exploring what if we just removed our icons. Icons are also difficult to maintain across IDs because every IDE treats them a little bit differently, and it creates also a maintenance burden. So again, what if we just say it's a file or a directory? These are patterns that exist already, but um, they could, it's just a small little tweak. But again, you wouldn't do this in the web if you're designing for the web first. So I went through some steps. You can see I tried multiple more variations. Once I got something that I was fairly happy with, I also wanted to prototype it. I feel like prototyping is something I'm trying to do a lot more of because it helps expose interaction patterns that feel a little bit awkward that you can't tell from static. So yeah, mock this all up, turn it into a component. And um, from there, I also jumped into things like multiple, sorry, context selection in the menu and things like multiple select, but just these individual interactions that I thought they weren't necessarily related, but maybe they all add up over time. So from there, yeah, and you can see here's even more extra states. Some of them I didn't even get to yet because I would just try to make a note. This is something I would like to give attention to. But um, to stay on track here, essentially what I'm trying to show is my work process here because a lot of this was me pitching an idea, not necessarily following requirements from my PM. So I also have weekly meetings with my PM, and so we're on the same page. And this was a way to visualize and communicate how we might have some ideas moving forward, but then break them up into chunks so that it can be actionable. So because there's a lot here, I like to record async videos because they can be shared across a lot of different teams. And so I essentially just did it one at a time. So step one, I mentioned this earlier, but I broke it up. So appearance, and then I did just kind of explain the design exercise, my hypothesis of why. So IDs are personalized, information dense tools where extraneous UI elements can frustrate users and reduce productivity over time, just so that people could get an understanding of where I was coming from. And then just went through and shared my ideas related to this specific section. And so if I go back to the issue, how I did this to communicate was I uploaded them each section. So again, this wasn't all done at once. This was done over a series of like a multiple days. But again, trying to use the iteration value that we have here and share it earlier rather than later. So I break up my comments, record my walkthrough video, and then I'll provide links to the specific concepts. So I'll highlight the summary and then you can see, click here, and it will open up the specific part of the mockup where I've added clarifying comments. And this works pretty well for async feedback, I find. So since feedback and collaboration was a big part of whether or the purpose of this issue, I put extra effort into trying to link to everything. So yeah, that's essentially the gist of how I went about sharing. Got a lot of conversation, great feedback. Ended up getting engineering involved, and we've been discussing ways to make this experience again a little bit more focused on the IDE because we definitely have product market fit in this area. So it's something that if we want to reach that target of really providing world-class experiences is just putting more effort into these sorts of ideas. And I think this is where design can really help with exploring ahead of time and providing sort of some visions and opinions that's based that can be testable and broken up into iterations. So the next steps I'd like to do is probably well, we need some team alignment on some of the other Duo features, but essentially uh, prototyping and breaking out the low-hanging fruit from the more ambitious ones and making sure that we are aligned with engineering on how we're going to build this. Right now, it's looking like we're moving towards web views, but that's a whole other can of worms that I won't get into here. But um, yeah, every time I had to do an update, I just made it its own section and recorded a little walkthrough. So yeah, that's it. I will jump to the no questions. Okay, perfect. Well, I will stop sharing.